Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So he said, I will destroy man, who I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord.
Part of what makes Jehovah such a fascinating participant in the stories of the Old Testament is his king-like jealousy and pride, and his great appetite for praise and sacrifice. But we have moved beyond this God, haven't we?
When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites and the Girgashites and the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them.
The forgotten Canaanites were pitilessly driven out of their homes to make room for the ungrateful and mutinous children of Israel. The ground is forever soaked with the blood of the innocent.
Be wise, O kings. Be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Wow. That's quite a quote. That was from Richard Dawkins. Good morning, and a very warm welcome to KBC. Perhaps a warmer welcome than you suspect, given the readings that you just heard. This is not going to be your usual Sunday pep talk, but this is probably the best year for Logos to tackle some really troubling stories. And you might say, why this year? Well, if you haven't heard, I'm going to let the press break it to you gently. Reading from The Australian. Bin Laden's terror reign over. That's right, this well-bearded face of global terrorism took out 3,000 people on September 11th, 2001. But this year, on May the 1st, the tables turned. Some Navy SEALs dropped into his Pakistani hideout to say hello, and a short time later, he was dead. So, how did you respond when you heard the news? Can you remember when you heard it? Now, millions of Americans were celebrating justice done and the triumph of freedom. Quoting one National Guard trooper, he said this, that there is no greater joy in my life than to know that this man is dead. No greater joy. Apparently revenge is a dish best served cold. Now, Australians typically, we're a bit more apathetic about it. You know, Osama's successor is in the wings, there's more leadership to come, and you know what, there's probably reprisal attacks. So any type of party seems very premature. But for the average onlooker, a really troubling question remained. Is religion responsible? Now, the president said that this is not a war on Islam. But surely this is not how it was perceived by many in the Middle East. At least from Al-Qaeda's perspective, 9/11 was consistent with the Quran. Now, what about Christians? Are our hands cleaner? Just a year earlier, I read an article called G.I. Jesus Joins the US War Effort. And it was basically about some soldiers in Afghanistan who, on their high-powered rifle sights, had bought from a apparently Christian company, bought rifle sights with Bible references engraved, like Jesus in John 8:12. Whoever walks in darkness and follows me will see a great light. Now the journalist commented and said, surely weapons of war is not what the Prince of Peace had in mind when he said the blind will get sight. Well put, touche. But is this right? I mean, think about it. I'm a Christian and often we'll call ourselves spiritual warriors. We mount crusades to bring those from the kingdom of darkness into the light. We fight against a cosmic terrorist named Satan. Now, it's a really fine line between a metaphorical crusade and a real battle where the blood of the enemy is spilled in dedication to God. Christians have fought under the cross. Mark Juergensmeyer is an expert on religious violence, and according to his data, it is on the rise. Now, religion is a really convenient excuse for crazy people to do crazy things, but he asks a deeper question. What if violence traces back to the religious texts themselves? What if terror is in the mind of God? In the book's front matter, starkly on a page by itself, he quotes God in Exodus. It says, I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people. Okay, most of us here are Christians and I'm squirming and I put this talk together. So we tend to sidestep these kind of issues. Hang on, wasn't this an Old Testament problem? Didn't Jesus sort it out in the New? Well, not really. You see, Jesus took earthly violence beyond the grave with his talk of hell. And he said he came to fulfill the Old Testament. He didn't come to take the unpleasant parts and to relegate them to the dustbin of history. Now, we may not talk about these violent stories very often, but they're in the Bible nonetheless. And we can't pick and choose. I just want the cuddly lambs, but please leave out the blood and guts. It doesn't work like that. It's one book. So, second sidestep. Well, look, I read these battles as a beautiful metaphor of spiritual warfare. Now, perhaps we do read it like that. But we need to realize that the only reason these stories of Israel escaping Egypt and David overcoming the giant, the only reason they have any value as a metaphor is because they actually first happened in real space-time history. The horse and rider really were thrown into the sea. And Goliath's reign of terror really was over. And these aren't isolated events. Who's read the Bible from cover to cover? Would you agree that the Bible is, in the truest sense, a bloody book? Yeah? We tend to avoid those bits, yeah? But it is. So what are we to do with that? You know, Yahweh used Israel as his sword to exterminate 7 people groups before Israel occupied the promised land. Now, there's this word in the Bible, in Hebrew, cherem, the ban. Now, call it what you will, but it's a little word with a disturbing double meaning. It means to dedicate something entirely to God, whether for devotion or for destruction. And it was a common warfare practice in the ancient Near East. And it doesn't show up often in the Bible, but when it does, it is shocking. It means kill everything, utterly destroy all life. Now, is this the God we worship? You know, when we tuck our kids in at night and pray the Lord our soul to keep, is this the God that we picture? This is a complicated topic. How do we make sense of divine violence? Now, given that it's such a hard topic, I'm really happy to lay the scene and then handball it on to 2 other people to actually deal with all the problems that I've raised. I get the pleasant role in that. So Beck White will come up soon and she's going to explore Joshua entering Jericho, taking out the Canaanites. And then Rowan Chapman is going to explore the true and better Joshua, Yeshua the Christ, Jesus entering Jerusalem to die on a Roman device of torture. Both of these stories are archetypal in a way. They both involve divine violence right at the center. That this God of love uses physical coercion that causes injury. Now, there's no simple answers in this topic, but maybe the title will help with the framing. God's 2 hands. God's right hand is that of judgment. It's his power arm, if you like. It's violence if you're against him, but it's deliverance if you're with him. So his right hand is the violent hand. But, you know, God takes 2 hands to hold the world, just like it takes 2 hands to parent, yeah? So wrath is only half of the story. Right from the Bible's start, we see God's left hand of mercy and grace wooing the world back to him. That firstly, he withholds the punishment we deserve. He then forgives any who turn. And then he offers us good gifts that we never deserved. So God has two hands. But even this is a bit of a problem. For instance, Joshua conquers Jericho, but Jesus is crucified at Jerusalem. It seems like, God's killing one minute, kind the next, the right and left hand taking turns. Is God confused? Well, we'll see. But let's start by opening the biblical text with the massacre at Jericho. Now, this is a graphic story, and in no way do I mean to make light of what appears to be divinely mandated murder. But I want to keep it family-friendly and G-rated. So to do this, I've drawn some help from the online site, The Brick Testament. So we're going to see this passage pretty much in Lego. So let's get into it. Enter Joshua 6 with the conquest of Canaan.
Jericho shut itself tightly because of the Israelites, with no one allowed in or out. Then Yahweh said to Joshua, "March all your soldiers around the city once per day for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing their trumpets. Then the whole army must utter a mighty war cry. Then the city's walls will collapse, and all the men can charge straight in." So Joshua got up early the next morning and had the ark go around the city with 7 priests blowing their trumpets and soldiers marching in front and in back of the ark. Then they went back to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they circled the city 7 times. Then Joshua told the army, "The city and everyone in it must be offered to Yahweh under the curse of destruction, Herem. Only spare Rahab and the prostitute and those in her house. Do not take anything under the curse of destruction, or you will put Israel under the same curse and bring disaster. All items of silver, gold, bronze, and iron belong to Yahweh and must go into his treasury. Raise the war cry, for Yahweh has given you the city." The trumpet sounded, and the army gave a mighty war cry, and the walls collapsed. The men charged straight into the city to destroy every living thing in it. The men, the women, the young, the old, the cattle, the sheep, and the donkeys. The 2 spies went and brought Rahab and her family to a place outside the Israelite camp. Then the Israelites burned the whole city and everything in it.
Well, great story. But does anyone else feel a little bothered by this account? Does God condone genocide? Is he okay with ethnic cleansing? In all of this, what about the Canaanites? Israel's conquest of the Promised Land begins in Jericho and nearly destroys the people group called the Canaanites, and God commands it. But how can God command the killing of people? Through the lens of biblical stories, we'll explore how God's justice and his mercy work in tandem. Despite initial appearances in both the Old and the New Testament, God's 2 hands work together to ultimately bless the world through his people. Reading from Deuteronomy 10, verses 17 to 19. "You are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt." When we read of the story of Israel driving out the Canaanites, perhaps we feel like first stepping in and saying, "Hey, Israel, pick on somebody your own size." But is this the case of the big guy picking on the little kid in the schoolyard? No, far from it. This verse in Deuteronomy is one of many reminders to Israel. Don't get proud. You yourselves were once slaves and foreigners in Egypt. God reminds them that he had to save them. They were the team finishing last, the underdogs, and God's left hand of redemption brought them out. God says to them, always show empathy to the outsider. All right, well, does it ever cross anyone else's mind why Israel is seemingly the favourite child? Now we hear they're plucked from danger, whisked into the promised land, and on the way they just nip a few rebellious nations in the bud. Is this the story that we're hearing? How do they afford to go from such slum dogs to millionaires? It would seem that Israel asked God the very question, why us? And this is what God made clear to them. It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going in to take possession of the land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations.
To condemn his action.
Israel was not elected by their merit. Israel was chosen to be God's instrument of his mission to restore the world. God's left hand of grace and mercy and his right hand of discipline and justice ultimately comes together to bless the world. This does not mean that God has to be nice to everybody or every nation, no matter how they behaved. As Christians, it is important and we should wrestle with what can seem like harsh and shocking behaviour from God in the Old Testament. We asked the question in the introduction, what about the Canaanites? If God actually said, leave nothing alive, total destruction, then doesn't that mean that innocent lives were taken by the swords of the Israelites? How does that seem very fair? Okay, could all the perfect people in the room raise their hand? No, I really want all the perfect people, I know it sounds funny, to raise their hand. Oh, okay. Issue with pride cuts out perfection. So, we all know, looking around and in our own hearts, no one is perfect. The Bible would teach us that we have all broken God's law and fall short of his standard of total perfection. No one is innocent. No one is blameless or without fault before God. Even if we don't believe in God, our own conscience would tell us that we've failed to meet even just our own moral standards. All right, so you and I, we're guilty. What about babies? Children? Those with disabilities? Are they guilty too? Not old enough to be weaned, but old enough to be held accountable for their wrongdoing? Well, firstly, the Bible would suggest that such people are spared from ultimate judgment. We must remember that an earthly end is not final damnation. Death is not the end. And we can trust that God, in his supreme love, can deal fairly with lives lost, who unfortunately were caught up in the sin of their culture or religion. Also, we need to recognise, which is hard in our culture and our environment, that our individual actions do in fact affect each other and society and our culture. Just like a parent's actions would affect the whole family and a prime minister's actions would affect the whole nation. In the story of Canaan, God is holding a whole people responsible for their sin as a collective culture. Every practice and decision that was being made was breathing into a toxic environment that was producing generation after generation of total rebellion against God. Enough was enough, and God stepped in. The practical issues surrounding God's judgment are too few to discuss right now, but for example, consider if the parents and the families had been killed, but God had spared the babies, how would they have survived? Would they fend for themselves? Finally, it's worth very humbly saying that some things are clearly God's prerogative. As difficult as it is for us to accept, God can create something and he can destroy what he has created. Although his wishes are constrained by his good and his perfect character. God cannot wish something that is immoral, and he cannot wish something that is inconsistent with who he is. But there is nothing patently immoral about the creator of life taking away life, even though, unfortunately, it may offend the creation. It's immoral for us to take life because we are not the authors of life. So when we take life away, we are usually exercising a prerogative reserved for God alone. But we must remember that God does not take life recklessly or needlessly. When he does take life, it's for achieving a greater purpose. All right, let's say we all agree. Even if God can take life away, that's his prerogative. Did the Canaanites really deserve to have their lives all completely taken away? Did they deserve their final fate? The real question behind this is, does wrongdoing deserve punishment? And if so, how much? Frame the question another way. A lot of you in this room will know the name Martin Bryant, the man responsible for killing and shooting 35 people in Port Arthur in 1996. Does he deserve to be punished? Or what about this name, Joseph Fritzl? He locked his then 15-year-old daughter in a basement and raped her up to 5 times a day, fathering her 7 children. He got life in prison. Does he deserve his punishment? Some would argue a much more severe punishment. Murderers, pedophiles, rapists. I think we would all agree that wrongdoing deserves some form of punishment. If God is real, who is more capable of weighing the right punishment to fit the bill? And what he deems as just punishment is therefore justice. God judged a culture that was entirely perverted by horrendous actions. The Canaanites actually mirrored the very violent, sexualized idols that they worshipped. This act was no spur of the moment, on a whim, random decision of God to just wipe out a nation. God had told Abraham back in Genesis 15 that he wouldn't punish the Canaanites unless it was fully deserved. It would seem that from the 500-year period from Abraham through to Joshua, the Canaanites rejected God's warnings and continued to move deeper into sin. We're not talking about little indiscretions. The Canaanites' culture included bestiality, child sacrifice, incest, cultic prostitution, just to list a few. God's left hand of grace and forgiveness waited patiently for 500 years in hopes of their repentance and turning back to him. When they stubbornly continued in their own way, Israel became God's vehicle of justice and judgment upon a corrupt society. It's important here to distinguish the moral difference between arbitrary violence versus violence inflicted within a moral framework of just punishment. Take, for example, violently smacking a child versus disciplining a child with an explained punishment for a reason that produces a good fruit. This does not make either of the situations pleasant or rosy at the time, but it is important that we place a violent story within its larger moral framework. Part of the problem here is that we want to hold God to the same standard of morality that he would hold us to, as if God and people were on the same terms when it comes to behaviour. Whatever we can't do, God shouldn't be allowed to do either. But every parent knows that such an arrangement would not work. Parents are not held by the same standards that their children are held by, for good reason. And in the same way, God has a different set of privileges as well. Life and death is his call, not ours. That's why it's appropriate for him to make sovereign decisions. That is, decisions that know everything from the beginning to the end. They see it all. Now, despite the rumours, I in fact am not sovereign and all-knowing. I know, comes as a blow to us all. However, the good news is that God is sovereign. He is all-knowing. He sees everything and understands every detail. It's important then that we trust him. He has the right reasons to make the judgment when it comes to justice, even if we are not so happy with the details. It's a really hairy and contentious issue, isn't it? But why do we feel so strongly that what God did wasn't fair? By what standard, what's our measuring stick for us to be judging God? Apart from God, we have no absolute source of morality. So everything would just boil down to personal preference. What's your opinion? If God doesn't exist, then our sense of right and wrong is nothing more than a biological impulse to help our species survive. In that case, The biological impulse has no sovereign claim on my life, and I can choose to ignore it. It makes more sense to me that the very reason we feel a sense and we struggle with what is right and wrong is because God's sense of right and wrong is imprinted on us. We're made in His image. His character is imprinted on our hearts. Our understanding of morality comes, I believe, from our common Creator. So God's right hand is firm on Canaan for a cause. Well, where's God's left hand for Canaan? In Ezekiel 18:21-23, God says, "Do I take any pleasure in the death of the wicked? Rather, am I not pleased when they turn from their ways and live?" God's right and left hand, His wrath and His mercy, always come together in love. This verse is powerful in revealing God's deepest desire. He will, by His character, rightly judge the rebels. But His deepest desire is that we would turn back to Him and live. He craves for us to respond to His constant left hand extended with grace and mercy. This is where we find life. In Deuteronomy, the same book that we read of the story of Canaan, it is also the place where God gives His law to the people of Israel. Now, we see in the law things like taking care of animals and livestock, being nice to strangers, caring for the poor. We see all of these things in God's law. God's commands are clothed with mercy and grace. They're clothed with His character, where what is right and honest is upheld, and the oppressed are not despised, but they're accepted, even if they're from Canaan. Enter into our story Rahab. Rahab had heard about Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. She knew that God was giving the land of Canaan to the Israelites because of their corruption. When the Israelite spies entered into Jericho, naturally the locals tried to kill them. So Rahab hides them at great risk to herself and her family in her house and protects them. Because of her faith in God, because of her response to God, she was spared and included in the nation, adopted into the nation of Israel. Here we see God's left hand clearly acting to save someone who had faith in Him, who responded to Him at the exact time that His right hand was exercising justice upon those who were bent on rebellion. This doesn't just go for individuals. This goes for entire nations. Think about the story of Jonah and Nineveh. Nineveh was an entire nation. And like with Rahab, God sent with His right hand a message that He would bring His judgment if they didn't turn and live. But all the while, His left hand was ready to respond to them turning to Him with grace and mercy, and He did. When they responded and turned from their ways, in 3 days, God spared the nation of Nineveh and extended to them restoration and grace with His left hand. This is God's message. This is the scarlet thread, if you will, in His tapestry of redemption. It's constant. The central issue is always our heart. It was then with the Canaanites, and it is now. The same sun that melts the ice hardens the clay. A hard heart that is hard against God is judged by His right hand. But a soft heart, willing to turn to God and find forgiveness and mercy, always will with His left. You may not actually know this, but Rahab turns out to be the great, so on and so forth, grandma of Jesus. Rahab the Canaanite becomes God's gift to the world. Blessing comes through the nations for the nations. And it all starts with God protecting Israel from violent and corrupt cultures, offering a safe place to grow up, if you will, and to mature so that they can have an environment that ultimately will bless the world. That is their job. They are moving towards the true and better Joshua. Canaan is just one step on the road towards the cross. In our story, enter Yeshua, Jesus the Christ, riding into Jerusalem. God's got the whole world in His hands, right and left. But it's worth asking, what if running the world was a one-handed affair?
Some say God is too soft. Some say God is too harsh. Of course, if we were in charge, we could do a much better job.
Ha! Just as I suspected. Look at it all. Sin, evil, corruption, and dubious conduct going on everywhere, and nobody doing enough about it. But I know what to do. As chairman of the International League of Instantaneous Sin Response, I know what to do in detail. Load the Sin Zapper units. Unit 1 to 1000, load with Thunderbolts. Unit 2, Unit 1001 to 2000, load with Sulphur and Brimstone. Unit 2001 to 3000, load with Tabasco sauce. Now, let's see what needs to be dealt with. I'll use the Sinoculars. Aha! Sector 4, embezzlement, graft, and corruption. Just as I suspected. Right, units 1 to 1000, hit them with the Thunderbolts. 100 million volts on each sinner. Go! Oh, I love it. Look at that one. I love it when their trousers burst into flame. Sector 15, robbery with violence. Right, Sin Zapper units number 1001 to 2000. Hit him with the sulphur and brimstone. Fire! Oh, yeah, yes, and not only does it hurt, but it smells like rotten eggs. Sector 50, aha, shoplifting minties from the confectionery aisle in Coles. Right. Sin Zapper units 2001 to 3000, hit them with the Tabasco sauce. Fire! Marked down and staying down. Oh, I love it, I love it, I love it.
But you can't deal with sin and sinners like that.
Yes, I can. It's the only way. You zap the hell out of them.
No, you must consider the heart. As president of the International and Global Fruit of Fuzzies Love, Care, Forgiveness and Friendly Fuzzy Fellowship, be happy, I say that forgiveness is what's required.
What a lot of soppy, lovey-dovey, namby-pamby rubbish. When the law's been broken, penalties have to be paid.
No. You need love and understanding. Love and understanding is what's required. Oh, look, Sector 27. It's still happening. Oh, look, this is a good example. Look, it's poor little Jack. Oh, he's at it again. Poor, lost, confused soul.
Great. Wind up the generators. Prepare to zap him.
Oh, no. Love and understanding is what's needed. Come to me, little Jack. Come. Oh, little Jack.
Little Jack?
Jack the Ripper.
What?
Oh, now, I don't listen to that nasty man and his punishment. I understand why you did it. You didn't mean to. It was the result of your childhood. There are mitigating factors. There must be counseling, forgiveness, facilitation, and empowerment.
I'll give him empowerment. 100 million volts of empowerment. Right up.
No. That's not funny. Have you even considered the effect that his upbringing had on him? Have you even stopped to think about the pressures he faces every day? The fact that he had a childhood completely dominated by the totally overbearing nature of his pet guinea pig. What right do you have to condemn his actions? He is merely expressing himself in his own way.
But he's a scumbag.
Don't say that. No. You'll make him feel guilty, and guilt is a negative emotion. And anger is of the devil. No, what is required is love and forgiveness and understanding.
Look, when someone breaks the law, a penalty has to be paid, so you zap them. I'd like to get his neck and
love, forgiveness, understanding. Yes, you've lost your heart.
And you're the Bleeding Hearts Club, namby-pamby. You've lost your sense of right and wrong.
And you need your juster tempest with mercy and forgiveness.
And you need to put some teeth into the way you deal with evil.
Oh, this is ridiculous.
Well, I'm not going your way. I can do this myself, single-handed. And I'm watching you. You're one of my regulars.
There you go. My fate was sealed in utero. Yes, I'm the oldest Chapman, so there you go. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the New Testament, where we find Jesus Christ, the individual that we as Christians base our life upon. And with a face like that, why wouldn't you? Let the little children come to me. Lay down your sword, Simon. But this Jesus individual behind me, it's a seemingly radical change from the sentiments of the God of the Old Testament. I mean, the characters don't exactly seem to be the same. Their actions are different, right? But Jesus is God. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So is it fair to say that the image behind me is the complete Jesus? Well, if we were to say, well, yes it is, then we would be unintentionally reinforcing the image of a bipolar God. Jesus was the sinner's friend, true, but he was nevertheless a controversial and even frightening character. Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? So this gives us another image. In fact, it's the image of Jesus, the fighting revolutionary. So this here is the Jesus who publicly condemned the Pharisees. This here is the Jesus who turfed everybody out of the city temple with a whip. The fact is that neither image works alone. And as you will see in this final section of the presentation, Jesus is the fulfillment of both these images, God's left hand and God's right hand in perfect equilibrium. We've all heard that old adage, gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Meek? Well, maybe at times. But mild? No. Mild is an adjective we should only use for cheese. To be mild is to be without strength or potency. You don't get killed for being mild. Looking at Jesus' own ministry, was this purely a left-handed extravaganza? No, right? During the Sermon on the Mount, he blessed the meek and the poor in spirit. Very well-known scenario. Very left-handed in approach. It's the essence of the left hand. But it's during this time that he makes one of several references to hell or Gehenna. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. Gentle Jesus. And he didn't apologise for any of the blood and guts within the Old Testament either. Instead, he argues, I have not come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come to fulfill them. Jesus was not a walking contradiction. He himself was the complete fulfilment of the Old Testament. We have watched the biblical narrative of how Israel has grown, but now they've come of age with the arrival of Jesus. Picture this. Your dad tells you that your sister is coming to dinner. He says, up until she arrives, lay the table, clean up the rooms, make dinner. But when she arrives, sit down, have a chat over the meal. Is your dad a hypocrite for giving you two separate things to do? No. Because when your sister arrives, the conversation that you have with her will be the fulfillment of all the preparation you did. Far from being hypocritical, Jesus was showing us his very nature. I am here to bless as well as judge. Both hands. So if he's here to bless as well as judge, we should expect to see more two-handed action. There is stark contrast in left and right-handed approach during Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. When he first glimpsed the city, this city being the spiritual and physical centre of the nation of Israel, he weeps that they were blind to what could have saved them. He comprehends the tragedy of the situation. Israel, like Canaan before them, had condemned themselves. And yet every lifeline that was thrown at them, they refused it. Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. It's a beautiful image. So Jesus heads to the temple. Some people know where this is going. I gave it away before. But instead of beholding the nation's purest place of blessing and worship, he sees a sprawling marketplace. His response? He made a whip out of cords and upturning tables and scattering the coins, forced the whole lot out. Everybody, every single moneylender, everybody. And at the top of his lungs, he was yelling, "Get out of here, you are making my house into a den of robbers." Gentle Jesus. This is God's nature to a T though. Jesus is slow to anger, but when something he loves so fiercely was abused and people did not respond, he responded. with a right-handed approach. But what after this? This is significant. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. No sooner has the right hand finished, Jesus is healing again. There was no case of, Lord, I have leprosy, cure me if you will. No, mate, I need to calm down. Hang on, mate, just wait. There was nothing like that at all. Jesus gets back to doing the work he genuinely prefers, extending grace and mercy to the humble at heart. No wonder the Pharisees got taken down a peg or two when they turned up. These were the men who had reduced God's blessing into a list of laws. Jesus rebukes them publicly. You brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Strong words. Jesus didn't exactly take them aside quietly and say, oh, excuse me, had you considered at some point that you might appear to everyone to be just the tiniest bit viperish? These were the men who were exploiting the law for their own ends by using the weak. But even as Jesus was delivering a justice long overdue for the Jewish people, he openly laments the fact that they missed the point. It's there, it's in Matthew 23:23. He's frustrated that Israel has missed its mark. They want ritual, but he wants justice, mercy, and faithfulness. That's what he wants. Now, hang on, backtrack. 3, justice. That's an interesting term. Can we talk of a just God and a loving God in the same breath? Well, the real question here is this. If God were to never punish sin, then in what sense could we say he is a God of love? Love is the unconditional will for the ultimate good of another. So when we're defining a loving God, the opposite of love is not hate. In fact, it's apathy. I mean, what kind of father doesn't care if one of his kids abuses another? And vice versa. The New Testament shows that God's two hands are not arbitrary in when and how they work. They link together in love. But it's not just because we see this in the teaching of Jesus. We see this fully realised in a single unprecedented event. Never happened before in history. The ultimate act of left-handedness. In humanity's greatest insult to God, in the midst of excruciating pain, in the midst of the most violent execution style possible, after being rejected and humiliated by the very people he wanted to save, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Violent justice and tender mercy met on those crossbeams. The full right-handed judgment of God was delivered on Jesus in excruciating right-hand action. But this is not a bipolar God who works through mutually exclusive instances of left-handed action versus right-handed action. It's not like that at all. Like the song says, he has the whole world in his hand. Plural. So God's dominant left hand offers grace, mercy, and love. Relational powers that do not coerce humanity, but instead invite us. By their very nature, these powers are not and cannot, will never be forced upon us. But it is in left-handed love that he has warned us of a coming right-handed judgment. Far from being apathetic, our God cares when something he loves dearly is hurt. Strewn throughout the Bible, there are signposts warning us to never conjure up the falsehood of some superior but albeit soft-hearted being. What kind of loving God wouldn't want to confront the mess that we've made of the world through war, through greed, lies, rape, hate? The flip side of that, which a lot of us will know quite well, is a promise. God loved the world so much that he will condemn those who have caused the brokenness and harm. And who's that? All of us. But his loving left hand has never, will never be withdrawn. Pierced by nails, it remains outstretched. in the incredible sacrifice of his only Son, Jesus Christ. So we know undoubtedly that our Father is left-handed, dominant, lefty. So does this mean we as Christians are only called to exercise our left hand, no matter what the cost is to us or our neighbours? Well, that would have been nice. Would have been ideal, in fact, had everyone been playing by the same rules. Some of you may know that I'm in my 5th year of work with the Australian Army Reserve. And that military environment has provided me with the invaluable perspective of a working Christian soldier. It was wonderful to see that video before of Mr. Close. Though, to be honest, if I did see him in uniform, I'd have to call him sir. Most of our missions are missions of mercy. Left-handed, mentoring, rebuilding. Even at home, you all would have seen the lads chipping in with the flood cleanup, whether on the news or in the flesh. But that being said, the right-handed role never ceases to exist. We are the Australian Defence Force. We are not the Australian, excuse me, do you mind, fellowship. The freedom that we experience, the freedom you're experiencing now as you sit here listening to this talk is because someone, a soldier, a police officer, a piece of legislation or the justice system responded with a right-hand approach for you. It is pointless to criticise all right-handed action when it is this very action that gives us the freedom to criticise. Violence itself is not redemptive. It never will be. But in a fallen world, genuine protection with the right hand is an act of love. Okay, so the Defence Force isn't at odds with Jesus. But what about the issue of religious violence? Isn't Christianity just part of the problem? And if the Christian God is violent, does this open up the gate for Christians to be violent, using their God as a precedent? It's a scary thought. I mean, Rick's not here, is he? He's on holidays. I can say this. Rick Benson comes up to the mic after we've finished and says, right, KBC, let's storm the council chambers and we're going to take down the bureaucrats who stalled our building plans. Well, you laugh. It's ludicrous. Absolutely it's ludicrous because it's not a valid approach. Any violent judgment from now till the end of time is God's prerogative. It's precisely because we know that our God is just that we can lead now with our left hand. Be a powerful peace witness in the present. If God were not angry at injustice and deception and everything else and did not make a final end to violence, then it's simple that God would not be worthy of worship. We are reconciled to God through Christ. Christ, the God-man who absorbed evil with pure love and offered grace and forgiveness to heal a fractured world. Now that there is our prerogative. How do we respond to God's ultimate act of mercy? There's only one real option, given the fact that he's the purest balance of both justice and mercy. To paraphrase John the Baptist, because he says it the best, repent, for the kingdom of God has 2 hands. Some people got it. Yeah, there we go. Like Israel, we've refused the lifelines thrown at us. But contrary to the Dawkins image, what you saw at the start of the presentation, he isn't some evil lurker of the stratosphere wringing his hands in expectant glee. Oh, I can't wait to hit those ones who didn't pick up my get out of jail free card. It's not that simple. We belong to a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness. He is patient, not wanting anyone to perish, but wishing everyone would come to repentance. Everyone. I'll leave you with a particularly favourite quote of mine. It's from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis uses Aslan as his God figure. Lucy, the youngest of the brothers and sisters, is somewhat nervous about a prospective one-on-one meeting with a lion. So she asks Mr. Beaver if Aslan is safe. Safe? Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the King, I tell you. Let's close in prayer. Father God, thank you for being a loving God. We hear so many times the story of your son's sacrifice, and we do understand it, but gradually it becomes a given. May we never, ever forget what took place on those 2 beams of wood. It wasn't a fleeting moment of mercy. It was a complete restoration of hope, past, present, and forevermore. What's more is that you showed us that you are a loving God, left-hand dominant. Gather us as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. Amen.